We need to talk about ideas, good ones and bad ones. We need to learn stuff about the world. We need an honest, intelligent, thought-provoking, and entertaining review of what the hell happened on this planet in the last 7 days. We need to sit back and listen to the Iron Fist and the Velvet Glove.
Yes, dear listener, a lot has happened in the last 7 days. It's busy times in the world. In our little study of society course that we're conducting here on the Iron Fist Velvet Glove podcast, there's momentous changes happening that normally might take several years, and they're happening in the course of a month or two. So I am Trevor the Iron Fist. With me, as always, is Paul the 12th Man.
Greetings, Earthlings.
And stepping in for the Velvet Glove is Was the beer sponsor. Good on you, Was.
G'day, listeners.
So tonight, dear listener, we've got a few topics to talk about, and if you're in the chat room, say hello and start off some conversations in there. We'll try and get to any comments that we can. So what's on the agenda? Well, we're going to talk about China, obviously. I mean, it's been in the news. We talk about China even when it's not in the news. So we're going to be talking about China. And we'll talk a little bit about COVID-19, and we'll talk a little bit about free speech and vaccinations. And sorry, Was...
Footballers.
Yes, sorry.
My favourite.
We're going to talk about footballers and a few other things along the way. But China, foreign policy and all that sort of stuff. But I'm going to lead off. I'm just going to say, language warning, by the way, dear listener. Like on this podcast, we do occasionally drop the F word. So
Fire truck.
Yeah, that's it. So, yeah. Look, this Morrison government is hopeless, in my view, and they've just proved it again this week. So they mucked up the whole COVID-19... Well, they mucked up the fires, the bushfires, for starters. They mucked up the COVID-19 economic rescue because they gave money to companies that weren't in trouble. Then they gave big money to JobSeeker, which encouraged employers to sack people. And then when it was too late, they then gave money to the employers and said, here's money to keep your employees, rehire them. But then they did it in such a way where the employers had to come up with all this cash because there's a big delay where they had to pay their employees all this money before they'd see any cash. And these guys pride themselves on being experts in business and understanding business. And, you know, if Labor had done half of this stuff, they would have gone, Labor don't understand anything about business. But fundamental errors about how business works, they had no knowledge of. What else have they mucked up? Well, they're mucking up our relationship with China. We'll get into that in detail. And they want to muck up our future rights by allowing Peter Dutton to set up Home Office Stasi by the looks of things. Like, they've been busy boys when it comes to stuffing up things, I think. So they just don't understand stuff. And again,
He knows marketing.
Yes, he does know marketing, it seems. Well, he doesn't actually, because he was a shitty marketer. When he was in the Australian Tourism Board and the New Zealand one, they sacked him.
Yeah, they sacked him. Yeah.
So his campaign with Lara Bingle and the Where the Hell Are You campaign was terrible. So
It wasn't well received.
no, waste of money. So no, he doesn't even know marketing. But
What did you think of the campaign?
I can't remember that much.
You don't remember it.
But
Do you remember
it wasn't-
Laura Bingle?
It wasn't
I
successful.
do remember Laura Bingle.
Yeah.
I
So
thought she was
I
outstanding.
remember things like that.
So we're going to get on to China, but before we do, it's also, if that wasn't bad enough, protests in Melbourne and Sydney
Yes.
over like all sorts of conspiracy things to do with, 5G and coronavirus. And people, there was a crowd in Melbourne who were chanting for Bill Gates to be arrested.
Oh, God.
Now, in Australia, they were chanting for Bill Gates to be arrested.
Yeah.
For goodness sake.
What was that fact I shared with you a couple of weeks ago? 4% of Americans think that the world is controlled by lizard overlords.
That's right.
And 4% of their population is 12.5 million people.
Yeah.
Actually believe lizard overlords control the world.
Yeah.
So
It's a worry.
It's depressing. And I'm really depressed because some of my right-wing friends
You have
Tony.
right-wing friends,
I do.
apart
Tony.
from right-wing Tony.
Yeah, Tony and David. David might even be listening.
Alan Jones.
So I've just been hearing so much anti-China rhetoric and sort of pro-Trump talking points on Facebook and social media. I just can't believe people are falling for this. So
But why are you linking anti-China with pro-Trump?
I'm seeing it from the same people. That's what I'm saying. I'm seeing really anti-China. We just shouldn't. We'll stop selling stuff to them. You know, that'll teach them.
Stop buying their rubbish.
Literally, let's stop selling them stuff because that'll teach them. And I want to smack myself in the head and go, that's not how it works. That's not how it works. But
Do you ever get that feeling, was it?
What feeling?
When you hear somebody say something about China and you think,
Yeah.
no, that isn't how it works.
we'll get on to China very soon. But before we do, just one more thing. And I got this article from The Australian. So The Australian is good for something. So, like, we do pick and choose.
Like when you run out of dunny paper.
No, well, they do have some occasional artists. Like, even the worst of sources can sometimes come up with something good. And my neighbour pointed this out to me. He is, he's retired now. He was one of Brisbane's most respected consultants, ex sort of Price Waterhouse, and still knows lots of people in the insolvency world. And basically, they're saying there's a ticking time bomb in the economy where Morrison has promised, until October, a bunch of money for different businesses. Here you go. And the other thing they've done is they've said, normally in bankruptcy, if you allow your company to trade and you know it can't pay its debts, then you become personally liable for those debts. But during this coronavirus crisis, the government said there's a 6-month sort of moratorium on that rule. So if you just persist and allow the company to keep going, we won't, you're not going to be caught with the debts. And so there's a lot of companies out there where they would normally have wound up, but they figure, I'll see it till through the end of October. And apparently there's just a heap of them ready to crumble come October. And there's a bunch of other businesses which might seemingly be okay, but they're relying on payments from those zombie companies. So we're not out of the woods by a long shot. So
Is that a bad thing though, that some businesses go out of business? Like if they're inefficient businesses, isn't it an opportunity to do a bit of a clear out? I mean,
there was a lot of marginal businesses.
The normal
already.
economic cycles, that sort of happens naturally, right? So
yeah, this isn't normal, and you're right though. It's going to be a clearing out of a lot of marginal businesses that were. But when it's done,
there'll be some short-term pain, obviously, but
Yeah.
it might actually prove to be beneficial in the longer term.
it would be better if you could do it gradually rather than a big shock, because even healthy businesses kind of don't know where they stand.
Yeah, if
and
it all falls over in the space of
that's
a
right.
month. Yeah.
If it happens really quickly,
I've never been a business person, so I don't really understand. But am I right in assuming there are a lot of small to medium-sized businesses who basically are always just getting by on a cash flow?
just making a living,
And that
just,
they can have a successful business over many, many, many years just because of that constant cash flow coming through the business. As soon as you stop that, it falls over, doesn't it?
Well, I think what you're saying is they're just marginal in that they're only ever just paying their debts and paying themselves enough, and there's never much left over, is kind of what you're saying.
Yeah,
And
like
yes,
a lot of cafes and restaurants.
and there's a
and
lot
things
of
like that.
mum and dad businesses out
Airlines.
there.
Airlines.
Like that. There's a lot. And so the point is, big problems ahead come October that
There'll be thousands of businesses falling over, won't there?
it seems that way. So if you're in business, think carefully about whether you are going to give credit to your customers and start taking cash only, because even what might look like a solid business could be shaky very soon.
And don't take anything you hear on this podcast as financial advice.
Indeed, and we're going to get to that. Don't take financial or legal advice from a podcast and seek your own professional advice.
Will the podcast survive financially? Will it be one of those businesses?
Will the beer sponsors be able to afford the beer?
Indeed. Actually, we've done all right with patrons
good.
in this coronavirus era. Yeah, quite a few people have signed up in the last couple of months.
I'd just like to say good day to Scott if he's listening and let him know that I'm drinking a Brewdog Punk IPA because that's what he used to do when he was on here.
He did.
That's how I got involved with the show as the beer sponsor.
Yep. So Scott may be back next month. He's having a time off. Yeah. Okay. So hello in the chat room to Kobe, Wheat Watcher, Xanthi and Ross. Right. China. Shall I just give an initial spiel and then you can just decide whether I'm speaking shit or not? But I've got... this is a delicate matter of diplomacy, Australia's relationship with China. And fortunately, dear listener, I have experience in delicate diplomacy.
You have experience?
Yeah, I do, yes, I do.
I'd be a terrible diplomat. I'd be a terrible diplomat. Because
I work in the Australian art supplies industry and nothing is more delicate and more complicated than that. Let me tell you. Yes. And here's the reason, because in most industries, you've got suppliers and you've got customers of some sort. And they usually only have the one hat. Like you're the person selling something and they're the person buying something. And it's usually a fairly uncomplicated relationship. But in the Australian art industry world, we've got a number of customers who have retail shops that we try to supply stuff to. They're our customer. But at another level, they're also running wholesale businesses where they're competing with us and trying to sell their sort of similar products to other shops. So there's a lot of players who are both wholesalers and retailers.
Yeah.
So I'm a bit of an observer and I don't get too involved in it, but I hear a lot of the stories. And so you'll be having a meeting with somebody where at one point you've got a hat on where you're the supplier and they're the customer. Hey, why don't you buy this? And then at the same time, though, they are your competitor, where you don't want to tell them too much about what you're doing because they might use that information and whatnot. It's a tricky relationship because you want to keep them on side as a customer to keep buying stuff, but there's always a tension because you're competing with them in selling stuff to other people in other shops. Does that sound tricky?
It does. In fact, it sounds like you've missed your true calling in life, Trevor.
So here's the point. Here's the point with China. We have a couple of different relationships with them. We are trying to sell them stuff. Like that's a significant relationship. But on the other hand, we have
$123 billion worth of stuff every year.
But on the other hand, we take our hats off and we have this other relationship of sovereign nations arguing over stuff that nations argue over and who their alliances are with and what other countries they control or don't control or seaways or all that sort of stuff.
And we're buying stuff.
Yeah. So
we're selling, buying and...
But from our point of view, most of it is we're selling stuff rather than buying stuff. But yeah, we do need Chinese goods and come coronavirus time we needed masks. And ventilators. So it's a relationship. So back to the art industry. When you're dealing with somebody and you've got to, at some point, you have to make a stand and say, no, I can't agree to what you want. Sorry, but here are my legitimate reasons and I hope you understand. Please keep buying, though, my products from you because I think you should see that I have legitimate reasons for disputing with you in these other areas. And you don't go out of your way to piss off your best customers. You don't start fights if you can help it.
Sounds like common sense to me.
Yeah. Well, and if you do start a fight, it's one where you know you've got some possibility of getting what you want. If there's no chance, you don't start. So to me with China, what we've done there is we've said we've picked a fight with them over something that we cannot win. So we said to them, and this is where you need to get to the history of what happened in the last few months. We said to them, we think there should be an inquiry that looks into how the virus started in the wet markets of Wuhan. And we also said...
I don't think we said that.
No, we did.
Did they mention wet markets?
They didn't mention Wuhan.
Well, in China, but obviously referring to Wuhan. Let me just see. Let me find the exact point. Here's what Morrison said on the 23rd of April. Well, this is what the sort of inquiry that they wanted was that World Health Organization investigators would be given the same powers as weapon inspectors to forcibly enter a country under an Australian government plan to avoid a repeat of COVID-19 global epidemic. And they called for an international review of wildlife markets.
Yeah.
And the new powers which Morrison was suggesting would drastically alter the operation of the World Health Organization by giving it power to go into a country to investigate a disease outbreak without the express consent of the nation's government. That's what Morrison was asking for. There's absolutely no way that China would ever agree to that.
I don't think very many countries would they?
Of course not.
So why did he even say that?
Exactly. Who would agree to that? All you're doing is saying you're some shitty tin pot little developing country that we can push around. Like, tell me about the embarrassment that China felt. What is it, 100 years of embarrassment?
100 years of embarrassment, yeah.
They deeply resent.
Deeply resent the humiliation of the 19th century in particular, yeah.
Humiliation.
1830 to 1930-ish, 100 years,
something like that, yeah.
It's deeply ingrained in them, the humiliation, and they will never, ever again suffer that humiliation.
No.
You don't have to be a diplomat with 20 years' experience to know that, and to know that this proposal was simply insulting and outrageous to a customer when you didn't need to be.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think Morrison was incompetent if he actually said that.
Absolutely.
He could have couched it in a much better way, couldn't he? That there's a big problem for the whole world.
Yep.
We need an inquiry. We need to understand how it happened.
Yep.
I think that's fair enough. I don't think there's anything unusual or extraordinary about having an inquiry.
No,
yeah,
but
I thought he was just asking
terms.
if we could come in.
No.
If the outside world could come in. He wasn't asking. It was more of a demand.
He was saying it was going to be like weapons inspectors.
Yeah, we're going to kick down your front door
Yes.
and storm in.
Without the express consent of the nation's government. Like, there's no way that
That
China
would
was
never
gonna-
happen in China. But
Exactly. So that was just picking a fight and insulting a customer. Now, okay, what he should have said was, China, let's work together, and what will you agree to in terms of an inquiry? Like, there's 1,000 different ways he could have phrased it that would have... But he was never going to achieve that purpose, and it was basically the day after he'd had a conversation with Donald Trump. So it really looked like... And Trump at the time was blaming China for the world's problems. So it really looked like that Trump just said to the Australian lapdog, go and stir up some trouble. Why don't you try and get this done? It seemed to me.
you can see how that perception would arise.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So...
But then Birmingham, our trade minister, I think he's been extremely diplomatic and speaks very well.
I don't mind Birmingham,
Yeah,
but
I think
Little
he's-
Proud's a nutter because Little Proud has come out.
What's his position?
Agriculture
Agriculture.
Oh, right.
Yeah, because what's happened now is China has agreed to an inquiry, basically that the WHO will conduct to look at the world's response to the pandemic, right? So that's what China's agreed with, which is a completely different kettle of fish.
Yeah, they haven't agreed to
Little
let
Proud-
people
The
come
world's
into
response.
China.
Little Proud has said, oh, there you go. Well, with China's agreement to that proves that Australia's a world leader on this issue. And China has come back today and said, you fucking idiot. Like, that's a joke.
Okay, so speaking of diplomatic language,
Yes.
the Chinese have violated that.
They didn't say, actually, you're a fucking idiot.
No, they did.
No, they said, it's a joke.
Yeah,
And
which is not very different, is it?
well, I think if I was the Chinese, I'd have said it. if you've suggested that you're going to send in like a weapons inspector into our country without consent, and now we're saying, well, we'll talk to the WHO and we'll agree to like. Honestly, good on China for saying you dickhead. I reckon.
Well, they're not being very diplomatic. I mean,
Who's
Morrison fucked up. Birmingham, I think, has handled the matter very, very deftly. And now the Chinese, embassy in Canberra have basically don't care how we feel about anything. They're like, you guys are a joke, I mean, that's not very diplomatic, is it?
Well, they're basically saying we've got power and you don't.
Oh, very much so.
And we're going to exercise some of that power. So if you want to insult us, we'll just check out some of this retaliation. Like, just
exactly
feel this.
Yes.
That's what superpowers do.
Feel this pain.
That's what superpowers do. That's what people with power do. When you get pissed by somebody, you say, hang on a minute.
I wouldn't
do
be
that.
like that.
No. Well, but, essentially, this was a hopeless endeavour that just wasted goodwill unnecessarily. Completely
Sounds like it.
What
amateurish.
goodwill there was, because let's face it, the relationship's been a bit strained for a while now.
Yeah. So,
It'd be a tough gig being a diplomat, though, wouldn't it?
well, it would be if Morrison's shooting his mouth off like that. So it doesn't have to be, though.
I wonder why he shot his mouth off.
Because he's got a backbench full of nutters like Fevriati Wells and Hasty and people who are just China haters who are just egging him on. So
Okay.
there's a bunch of them there. There's a lot of anti-China rhetoric out there from these people who see the evil communist empire. And as we discussed last
It
week...
is. They're
Paul,
right on that point.
Paul, the evil
That's
or the
not very
the
diplomatic,
evil
Paul.
or the communist part, they're not communist.
They are communists.
Communism is the state ownership of the means of capital.
Not anymore, Trevor.
Control of
That-
production.
that
Try
is
to
the-
keep up. This
that-
is the 21st century, Trevor.
The definition of communism's changed.
Communism now is the communists control the government and they let you run your business as long as they get their kickback.
Here's a lesson. You know when you see something like the People's Democratic Republic of Congo or something? Well, just because they have democratic in the name
Really?
doesn't mean it is.
That's false advertising.
So
Well, the North Koreans call themselves democratic as well.
yeah, so when you have the Communist Party, it doesn't mean that they're communist. And in fact, they've said communism is our goal. It's not where we are. So it's seriously, Paul, they're not communist because there's so many billionaires and millionaires in China now. So much is privately owned, and it's a market economy. Like it's
Yeah,
not
they don't directly control production, but they probably indirectly control it.
There are certain things like Huawei would be owned by the government, for example. Now, Huawei is a good example, right? So that was a case where Australia was right to say, no, we're not letting you.
So you agree with that?
Yes.
On what grounds?
Because Huawei is clearly a part of the government arm. You wouldn't allow any government to control your telecommunications. You wouldn't allow any foreign government to control it. So that's one where, as a minor power, we could say to China, no. And here are our reasons. And we can actually get what we want because we get to decide no. In the same way, we could say, we're going to stop all flights from China because we can. We can say, we're going to stop. But we can never say to them, we're going to force you to take COVID inspectors whenever they want to into your country. We just can't force them to. There's a big difference there. You've got to know when you've got a chance of winning and when you don't. So,
look, I still think you're wrong about the Chinese Communist Party. They're very much a communist party. They've just decided that a market economy works better and serves their purposes. But they're still a communist party.
They learnt that lesson the hard way.
they're not interested in people owning the means of production. It's
Not
owned by
anymore. No, they've
so that
changed
means
their
they're not-
economic model.
That means they're not communist.
Well-
This is being in the Communist Party gets you an inside running to being part of the oligarchy. It's an oligarchic market economy.
Yeah.
It's capitalism.
But you could use the same reasoning to say that no communist party ever has been a true communist party.
No.
Couldn't you?
No, you could find some examples of about, well, Cuba, you could say, was communist.
Really?
Yeah. So there would be different states at different times you could say were communist. So, but you couldn't say that today's China is communist.
If you were starting a business in China
Yeah,
and you were Chinese,
yeah.
it would pay to be a member of the Chinese
Of
Communist
course.
Party, wouldn't it?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
It's
If you want your business to succeed,
absolutely.
And
Gives
if
you an
you're not a
inside running,
member,
your chances are
they're
very
not controlling
zero.
it
you
directly.
pay kickbacks to the local party representative.
Of
or-
course, of course.
They have their hand in everybody's pocket.
Yeah. So it's a means of acquiring power, but it's entirely different to being a communist state.
We need a new definition for what they are.
What? No, you just
disagree.
Quasi-communist.
I think they're just a communist party that are adapting to
You
the
agreed to this last
circumstances.
year, last week, 2 weeks ago. You agreed with me when I
That
said
they're not communists.
Yes, you said I'd never thought of it that way. I guess you're right.
Look, I think you can make all sorts of arguments to suit your purpose about communism, about capitalism, whatever.
Have a read of Archie Brown, The History of Communism, and he gives a really good explanation of how communist states have risen, evolved, fallen away, and it's clearly not communist.
I've been
as-
reading quite a lot about China in
Right.
the last few weeks.
Right.
I've been swatting my university
Okay. Well, when you've
textbooks.
got an oligarchy of princelings owning everything, that's capitalism. That's not communism.
That doesn't make them capitalists.
It's not communist.
Okay. We agree to disagree.
Maybe it's somewhere in between.
I think
But
it's
hang
just
on, I've given a definition of communism, meaning the state ownership of the means of capital, right?
Yeah.
That's communism. Now
I think
you
it's
tell me
state control of production,
ownership as well. not
ownership
just-
and control.
okay.
So
But-
you tell me what's your definition of communism that it falls within?
They probably control it, but don't own it.
But America
I think they're
controls
just
its
adapting.
economy.
I think they've just adapted to the times, and they've
So give me a
realised.
definition of communism that makes them communist but doesn't make New Zealand communist.
I'll get back to you with my definition next week.
Okay.
But what I would say is that
Because you just can't say, oh, they're not. You have to
every communist party has adapted it to their own circumstances. The Russians got Leninism, They even called it Marxist-Leninism, In China, it became Marxist,
But you see, it doesn't
Mao
matter
Zedong
what
thought.
labels you give it. The People's Democratic Republic of Congo isn't democratic. Like, just because you give it a label, you have to look at the underlying truth that's there. In the chat room, good on you, everyone in there. Blair Steele says, it's very hard to change to cash if you've given a line of credit to your customers. That's where I said, don't give credit. But what you do is you offer them a discount and convert them to COD. So get them in that way. Right. Okay. What else did I want to say about
China.
Yeah. So here's the other thing: is uproar about beef
And barley?
and barley. Yeah. So barley. So Wheat Watcher's in the chat room, and Wheat Watcher sent a message earlier saying, "Don't you dare link barley to COVID." And I think he's right. So I've
The
got
media certainly has linked it,
yes. So
and the beef.
so I've got a link to an article about dumping, and this is by a guy called Wei Huan Zhu.
That's Chinese for Wheat Watcher, I think, isn't it?
It could be. It's very close.
Your Chinese is very good, Trevor.
Yeah, Wheat Watcher, that wasn't you. Anyway, he's in this article. This guy is saying that this whole problem of anti-dumping stuff has been gurgling away for years. And essentially, Australia basically accused China of dumping steel, cheap steel, and
Among other things.
Yes, and amongst a whole bunch of other
A
things.
whole bunch of other things.
And has accused China and has therefore imposed sort of extra duties and sanctions on Chinese products. And really, his article is saying this is a response to that, where China's saying, we've had enough of that and we'll take on barley. And they've done it because it's one of those ones where it's going to be really difficult to sell the barley anywhere else. And it's going to cause sort of maximum pain, and China can easily get the barley from somewhere else if it needs to. So it seems to be more of a response to the anti-dumping sort of.
Can you just explain to the dear listener what dumping is?
Yes. So dumping is where. So the Chinese are saying that the price for the barley as it's landed in China,
That we're selling it to them for?
yes, is cheaper than what barley is sold for in Australia. So there's funny business going on that means that you are providing some subsidy somewhere along the line that and countries don't like it when a product is dumped on them because it often then means that their own industry can't compete properly.
Could that possibly be that we're selling 95% of the barley that we produce to China and it's just so cheap because of the volumes?
I imagine there is some
Economies of
reasonable-
scale effect that...
You've still got to ship it across an ocean.
Yeah.
That would surely add some cost. You've got to
Yeah.
pop it in a ship, get it across
just
there and unload it.
I just imagine that we sell a lot of barley
Yeah.
to China. And
China has been accused of dumping for many, many years now, and not only by Australia, but by a whole range of countries, particularly the United States. China was dumping, according to the Americans, a whole range of products, very important products like steel, for example.
yeah,
And it put American steelmakers out of business.
yeah.
I think it probably put some Australian steelmakers out of business.
It could do if you allow dumping to happen.
Yes.
But we're producing it and selling it to Chinese markets cheaper than what the Chinese barley growers can grow it. That's the main problem, isn't it? They're trying to protect their own industries.
That's normally the rationale for complaining about anti-dumping, complaining about dumping. That's
So I
normally
imagine
the
there's some
rationale.
barley that's grown in China and it's sending the Chinese
But it could well
farmers under.
But it could well be that they've just picked this as a product where maybe there's not a strong barley producing sector in China, but they've got lots of options to get barley from somewhere else. They can see they can score a few points, and they
Cheaper and better quality
picked
elsewhere.
this one as an easy one. Wheat Watcher, who literally is a wheat watcher, like he
Yeah.
looks at grain and stuff. In the
We
chat
should be
room,
talking to him about this.
well, he said there are quite a few factors. I don't think COVID is one of them. And he says, you are kind of on the right track, ... Well, that's good.
That's very diplomatic.
Yeah, kind of on
Wheat
the right
Watcher?
track. Yeah. So with the barley, it seems to be that this is a long-running thing and China's saying...
Has anyone asked, are there barley producers in China whose business is threatened by...
I thought that's what dumping was all about.
That's
I thought it was
usually
not so
about.
much that you were selling it to an overseas market cheaper than what you were selling it to customers in your own country.
Apparently it's for brewing beer and stuff, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is
Wheat
that right?
Watcher, is there a
Yeah.
barley...
A barley industry in China.
yeah,
But
and-
we've got a free trade agreement with China, so I would have thought all of this would have been...
No, you still can't do dumping under a free trade agreement.
No,
Free
but
trade-
I thought anti-dumping clauses would have been written into free trade agreements. Like what's
Well, there's a World Trade
or
Organisation.
price
There's-
limits.
There's an
or
international
something.
World Trade Organisation agreement on dumping. So
Yeah.
this is under the general agreement. It's not necessarily under the free trade agreement. So this applies to any country.
Okay, so the barley doesn't fall under the free trade agreement. That
Well, even if it
Even
did,
with free
a
trade,
free trade
you can
agreement simply
still
says
bring a dumping charge against another
a
country.
free trade agreement simply says between these countries we agree we're going to have really low or non-existent duties to encourage trade. That's what a free trade agreement does. So
does it limit
still doesn't-
quantities?
It still doesn't mean, and it depends. There's on a free trade agreement, there's all sorts of exceptions and limitations and provisos are written in for
Yeah.
various industries. Like we had a free trade agreement with America, and like we thought, great, we'll finally be able to sell sugar to the Americans. And they went, oh, actually, no.
Except for sugar, right?
Sugar's not counted. We don't, sugar's off the table. So
these free
'cause we
trade
don't want- 'cause
agreements
we don't want
take
it.
decades to hammer out.
Yeah.
And you're telling me they got no detail in them. Like what?
Right.
What are they talking about for 10 years? You know, if they haven't got prices and quantities and
Right. Anyway, Wheat Watcher says the anti-dumping claim is specifically in relation to 2016 Australian barley crop. In that season, we produced a record-breaking crop.
right.
There you go.
And the Chinese have accused Australia of subsidising it through things like fuel excise. You know how the government doesn't charge excise, or they reduce the amount of excise they charge on diesel fuel on farms, and there
And
was
mines. And mines.
and mines.
Yeah.
And there was one more thing that I read in one report, and it was about the government investing money in infrastructure for the Murray-Darling Basin irrigation scheme.
Yeah.
Now, the Chinese are saying because the Australian government put money into the immigration infrastructure, irrigation, sorry, not immigration, obviously,
Yeah.
that they're counting that as a subsidy. But the Australians made the point that a lot of this barley comes from Western Australia,
Yeah.
which is about as far in Australia as you can get from the Murray-Darling Basin. So clearly it's not relevant, at least in
Maybe
some
maybe you
of them.
should get Wheat Watcher on to explain
Well,
dumping and
He said,
barley.
he
to
said
us.
send me the Zoom link, and,
Oh, right.
and this is really testing my my stuff here. So we'll see if he can join us. And
Your ability to multitask is fantastic.
well, don't speak too soon. So we'll see if he turns up in the Zoom. I'll be trying to see there, Wheat Watcher, if you can zoom in. So anyway, here's the thing that gets me about this is the uproar about China flexing some muscle on trade, and how dare they?
in response to COVID-19.
Well, or just in response to our anti-dumping stuff, like this sort of tit for tat sort of action between countries is quite normal. So, Wheat Watcher, it's on the screen. If you look on the screen, you'll see under my picture is the link detail. So look for it there. So to give you an example, with beef, like we last year we used to export a lot of beef to the EU, and the reason we did was because the EU had a fight with America over labelling and some other sort of things. Hormones.
Yep.
So then what did America do? They applied pressure and said, oh, we're going to get rid of...
we're not going to buy your cars.
We're going to do some other thing with you, which put pressure on them to say, oh, actually, okay, we're going to start buying beef from you, and that means we're no longer buying beef from Australia.
and it's just normal part of doing business.
Exactly. And when did people say, oh, those goddamn Americans, they're taking our beef business off the EU? Where were
Bit of a
they?
double standard.
Like if you want to gripe about China doing this sort of activity, then gripe about all the other ones that they do.
Yeah.
Or if you want to gripe about a country taking away some of our business, we signed up for fighter jets from the US, and we agreed to buy 72 jets for $17 billion. And part of the deal was some of the parts will be made here, which will be worth about $1.3 billion. Right? Donald Trump, a couple of days ago, that's a crazy idea. We're not going to do that. We should be making all this stuff here in good old US of A. Fuck that.
American jobs.
And what...
There's nothing in the media about that.
Scott Morrison's response, I hope it's just electioneering bluster from Trump. He said he'd wait and see what happens. But where is the outrage? If you're going to be outraged about China screwing us...
Be consistent.
Be consistent about when... Yeah.
Where's the outrage coming from, though? Because I haven't seen any outrage from the Morrison government. I've just seen outrage from the media and links being drawn between their tariffs on barley and beef and links being drawn back to COVID-19 because it makes a good story. And I imagine if you were to quiz the average Australian about this and ask them, why is China doing this? They wouldn't hesitate to say, oh, that's because we wanted an inquiry into the origins of COVID-19.
Bali, obviously,
And there's no evidence to suggest that it's got anything to do with.
there is evidence, actually.
What evidence is it?
The
timing.
with the beef,
Yeah.
it would appear that the beef is about fine details, like it's a regulatory...
Yeah, labelling and...
Yeah, stuff
And it's
like
been
that.
going on for...
No, it hasn't. Well, it may well, but one of the beef producers in question was interviewed, and he said, look, this is not the first time, it's not new. We're used to dealing with this kind of compliance issue. He called it a compliance issue.
Yeah, I just think it's...
But
the
it would
media
appear
trying
that
to-
they picked on just 4 particular beef producers
And one of them's part Chinese owned.
as a sample, just to demonstrate what they can do to us. You know what I mean? They didn't pick on every beef exporter to Australia. They just picked out a few and said, okay, we'll block these ones to start with and see how you guys like that. And if you think that we're not serious...
But that's not damning evidence to say that we're doing this because...
It's not damning
But
evidence,
the timing is
it's a pretty
sort of-
strong indication that there is a link between
but if you're
the beef and the
in a
COVID
court of law, that
inquiry.
wouldn't stand up as evidence, would it? It's highly speculative. So
The timing is suspicious.
Very suspicious.
that's the timing. That's
Yeah,
it.
Yeah. But when you said, I don't see anybody complaining, well, have you been reading the letters to the editor in the Courier Mail?
I read them religiously, Trevor.
But this one is from Mick Barker at Stafford. It's time our government started playing hardball due to China's suspension of beef exports and the possibility of an 80% tariff on Australian barley. Firstly, terminate the 99-year lease on Darwin Harbour and all water lease agreements they have purchased. Secondly, restrict them from buying more properties due to the downturn in property prices and the exchange rate of the dollar. Thirdly, if they want our coal and iron ore, then make them pay the price we set, not what they demand. Oh, that's easily done, Mick. We'll just make them pay the price we set.
I hope Mick felt better after he wrote that letter and sent it
Probably
off.
did.
Yeah.
But that's the media whipping up that outrage.
Yes.
It's not the government being outraged. It's
That's
the
right.
It's the media.
And it's an relatively uninformed...
If you haven't picked up on it yet, dear
member of
listener,
the
I don't
public,
like the
which
media.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody puts a lot in. We don't put a lot of store in comments from random members of the public, do we?
No, but it's just
Unless
an
they're
indication.
listening to the podcast.
I just think there's a lot of anti-China rhetoric and feeling
There
out
is.
there that's being
There
whipped
is.
up, and I think I'm just trying to give the other side.
But
to
look, the
story.
Chinese have formed, Trevor. Let's face it, over the last few years, they've been repeatedly pushing the limits in the South China Sea is a very clear example. They were taken to the International Court of Arbitration for the Sea, I think it is, by the Philippines government. The Philippines government won the case and the Chinese just thumbed their noses at it.
Yeah. Can I
So the
just
Chinese have a lot of form.
Yeah, okay. But can I just point out one thing on the South China Sea? Like, America wants to sail its ships through the South China Sea, right? Imagine if China was to sail its ships off the coast of Florida in a similar fashion.
They probably do.
No, they don't.
Are you sure?
Absolutely not. Like,
That's a good point.
imagine what the uproar would be if off the coast of California or Florida, as close as what US ships are to China, imagine if the Chinese had their warships doing exercises there.
I'd be very surprised if they're not.
They're
Trevor.
not.
How do you know?
Because we know they're not.
How do you know?
Because I read.
They certainly sail down off the coast of
They
Australia.
They don't conduct the same sorts of... Look, when they showed up in Australia off the coast, it was
Yes.
holy shit.
Yes,
Did you see
remember?
that? Yeah.
Remember when the
Exactly.
Australians and Americans were having war games on the coast of Queensland?
And they went...
There
"Look
was
at
a
that."
Chinese intelligence ship
And
off
it was
the
a
coast.
shock that they were actually there.
No, they've done it every time.
It was a shock. They were like, where did they come from?
I don't think it was such a shock. I think they expected them to be there.
Find me evidence that the Chinese regularly conduct the same sort of manoeuvrings off the coast of America. It doesn't happen.
Very surprised if they didn't.
It doesn't happen.
But we are tending towards a culture where there's good guys and bad guys, aren't we? Like it's becoming very black and white, and I blame Walt Disney for it, to be honest. But you know,
Disney.
well, you know, the last couple of generations have just grown up watching TV and movies where there's a definitive line between the good guy and the bad guy, isn't there?
Yeah.
And it's like you're either one or the other. There's no grey.
There's no in between.
And people have taken that into their personal lives, and it's like, well, the good guys.
Was it not always thus?
No.
You don't think? I grew up watching Disneyland too, and I share your feeling about Disney. I think Disney has an unhealthy influence in popular culture myself. But
Anyway.
Right. One last thing on this before we move on to other issues. Saw this one in the John Menadue blog where it says that how is it that commentators on China get away with outlandish statements that don't pass the most minimum scrutiny? Take, for example, Dr. Clive Hamilton's statement commenting on tensions with China and broadcast on SBS TV on the 5th of May. That quote, "The United States is not going to unilaterally undertake some sort of military action, but Beijing may well do that."
yeah, that was a really dumb thing to say.
Yeah.
Who's Clive Hamilton again?
He's like in charge of the Australia Institute, and he's written various books. Like he's a leftish intellectual. Yep. So he's a really anti-China
member of your tribe.
But he's a real anti-China sort of character. So anyway, that's the sort of stuff that happens. And nobody on SBS said, "Hold on a minute. What are you talking about? You cannot be serious."
What do you expect on SBS?
Yeah. there you
What
go.
did he say again?
He said that the United States is not going to unilaterally undertake some sort of military action, but Beijing may well do that. So he's saying the chances of America doing it were nil, but much higher than China would.
You don't think he's got a right to say that? If that's his opinion?
He can say it.
Trying to switch it up to free speech argument?
He can say it, but SBS should have said, well, based on the evidence of history of the last 70 years, you have no reason to say that, because if what we've learnt from previous conflicts is that if anybody's going to start a military
But
conflict, it's going
It's
to
an
be
odd
America.
thing for a
he would
leftist to say,
probably
isn't it?
say in response to that, well, you know,
Times are different.
America in their role as the world police have got to fire a few bullets. Like,
He might well do, and then, but in which case it proves that he's wrong. Because as the world's police, they're out there firing bullets regularly, so you can't say they're not going to start something.
well, they wouldn't start something with China because it wouldn't be in their interest to start something with China. It would damage them so badly economically. If they started a war with
Depends.
China,
It depends. Are you selling military hardware? In which case, war's a good thing.
I'm sure there's some businesses within America
Yeah.
who would
Because
love to have a war with anyone
Ultimately, it wasn't
because
in
they
America's,
sell military equipment. But
ultimately, it wasn't in America's interest to go into Vietnam. Like, it was just a punch on the nose. It
it didn't work out well for them.
no.
It worked out well for the arms manufacturers,
Yeah.
So,
but nobody else.
yeah. All right. Sorry, Wheat Watcher, if you couldn't work out that Zoom link. I think I've got it running. I can't see you trying to join, but if you have, sorry, I'm doing my best, but I can't see you there. Okay. Free speech. Anti-vaxxers. Let's get into that.
Footballers.
Yeah. Deep breath, footballers. Let's start with some ethical principles and some legal principles, and then apply them to the practical situations that we've been faced with. So, free speech, ethical stuff. The harm principle says people should be free to act however they wish unless their actions cause harm to somebody else. So, this is a central tenet of the political philosophy known as liberalism, and was first proposed by English philosopher John Stuart Mill. So, free to act as you wish, provided you don't cause harm to somebody else. Sounds like a good basic starting point. Yep, all in agreement on that.
Depends on what you call harm, though,
Yes.
doesn't it?
That's right.
That's the grey bit.
Indeed. So the sticking point comes in trying to define what counts as harmful. So,
A lot of people set a pretty low bar these days. for
Yeah.
harm, don't they?
Yeah.
so just some other ways to think of these things. So I've often mentioned in the past about buying a faulty toaster or something.
You have.
Are you guys aware? Have you ever heard of the case of Donahue and Stevenson?
No.
Right. So any sort of introductory law subject in a business course, or if you do torts in law school, you'll be introduced to Donahue and Stevenson, the snail in the bottle case. So
Snail in a bottle.
yes. So
Like a drink bottle or something.
yeah. So up until this case, if you were injured by somebody, there needed to be some sort of contractual relationship. So, but what happened in this case was that Mrs. Donahue drank ginger beer and it happened to have a dead snail in it. And so she sued.
She didn't enjoy it.
No, it was only after she drunk the first half that she then tipped the rest of the bottle out, and there was the dead snail, and she'd already consumed half a bottle and fell ill and went to hospital and blah blah blah. So she sued the manufacturer, who she did not have a contractual relationship with, because she bought the bottle from the shopkeeper who had bought the bottle from the manufacturer.
Yeah.
So the shopkeeper was saying, well, not my fault. I didn't do anything wrong. Like I couldn't see inside the bottle, dark glass.
You can't expect me to check inside.
Exactly.
Yep.
And that was where they basically said, what's foreseeable? And they created this tort of negligence. So basically, you must take reasonable care to avoid acts or omissions which you can reasonably foresee would be likely to injure your neighbour. So who is your neighbour? The answer is persons who are so closely and directly affected by my act that I ought reasonably to have them in contemplation, as long as so affected when I'm directing my mind to the matters, blah, blah, blah. Basically, if you're manufacturing soft drink and your warehouse is shoddy enough to have snails around and the process is such that a snail could get into a bottle, you could foresee that
You're on
somebody
the
could
hook.
drink it. And therefore, if you can foresee that sort of harm could happen, then you're going to be liable, even if you don't have a contract. Right? So that's Donahue versus Stevenson. So, so we've expanded that then, where we've got consumer laws. So we say we're not going to wait until somebody drinks the snail in the bottle. If we see a shoddy item, as a matter of sort of consumer law, we can stop you from selling that item. So you have brought into the country some toy, and it's obvious that small parts can break off, choke a kid. We're not going to wait for some poor kid to suffer. We're going to stop you even before then. So that sort of consumer laws have come in. So with the Healing Church was selling the bleach.
Oh, in the bottles, yes.
Right.
We saw in an article.
And so the Therapeutic Goods Association said, we're going to fine you $150,000 without even waiting for somebody to drink that bleach, because it's clear to us that this is a likely event that's going to happen. Yep. So we accept, and I think even Libertarian Paul would accept, that all makes sense so far. Like, you don't have any issues with our society controlling people's actions in that regard so
No,
far?
I think consumer protection is fine.
Yep. So that's manufacture of products. What about advice, words, speech? So, case of MLC and Evatt, which basically decided you can have negligent misrepresentation on financial advice. So some report was prepared about the financial viability of a company, and somebody else got hold of that report, relied on it, and the report was dodgy. They suffered financial loss, sued the person who produced it. So basically a similar principle. If you produce a document of financial advice which is wrong, knowing that somebody might use that advice, then you could be liable.
But if you're an epidemiologist and you produce a report that's horribly wrong and cause
and you make
economic damage,
predictions
you
that
just
don't come
shrug your
true.
shoulders and
Well, we'll get on to medical advice in a second. It's all part of the lead up.
Yeah, righto.
Stay with me on this.
Yeah.
So you can be sued for bad advice, right? And that makes sense as well. Yeah, if you make bad advice, same as make a bad bottle of ginger beer, you can be sued for it. Yep. So we don't have consumer laws on advice. So we don't have like the therapeutic goods thing because you can't really. You can't look at a container full of advice and go, "Oh, that container's shit, send it back," or like just doesn't work that way. So what we have is more like consumer laws on advisors. So we say, if you want to give this sort of advice, we're going to stop you or regulate you. So financial advice. I couldn't in any forum say to somebody,
heavily regulated.
you should be
financial
buying
advice.
Westpac shares. It's a great deal, and you'd be mad not to. Like, if I was to say something like that, that's giving financial advice about securities, and the law says can't do it.
But we can say don't drink bleach to get rid of COVID-19. We can confidently say that, right?
I'm leading up to this. So the point is, are you happy with the regulation of financial advice that stops shoddy people from giving it, and that we say no, only people with this certificate and this training, and even as a lawyer, like with a law degree, you have to have a law degree. Plus, you've got to be registered as a legal practitioner. Plus, you've got to have paid the insurance. And only then will we let you give legal advice. So these are all impositions on freedom of speech that we've decided are fair because of the potential harm that could come down the track. Right. I was talking to Deep Throat and I said, so what's the restriction on medical advice? And it didn't seem like there's much. Like it seems like that you can't call yourself a medical practitioner unless you have got the appropriate registration, and you use that in order to charge Medicare and make money through our Medicare system. But essentially, don't take legal advice from a podcast, dear listener. So don't do this.
Medical advice. Can we give out medical advice?
Don't take legal advice from me either. Okay. But it seems to me that it's looser in that people can say medical things.
Seems like a double standard, doesn't it?
Like, I recommend you drink this bleach. And it's not regulated in the same way that we've regulated financial advice or we've regulated legal advice.
What's more important, your
The
money
consequences
or your health?
could be just as bad or even worse. Yeah.
So what would you think of a proposal that if we've regulated these other forms of advice, should we be regulating medical advice to say,
Absolutely.
Yeah. But Paul, you would say, what?
I would say, you tell me what I would say.
I'm suspicious.
I've got something to add here. Yeah. Like, I'd think if a medical practitioner, like to be a registered medical practitioner, you have to have some sort of license or
you'd have to be registered with some sort of medical.
Yeah, if you gave shoddy advice, you could be deregistered.
Yes, if you go, yes. And that's where that Dr. Koch, was he? The guy who was saying nasty things about people who were wanting, remember a few weeks ago?
David Icke?
No, there was that guy who was saying nasty things about people on social media, and he kind of got suspended from medical practice, I thought. Anyway, sorry to interrupt. You keep going.
But if you're a TV celebrity like, what's that guy who used to be on the cooking show, My Kitchen Rules or something?
Right.
That guy.
Pete Evans.
Yeah. If he gives advice on diet and has no qualifications, no registrations, no licenses, you'd be an idiot to take advice off him, wouldn't you?
Yes.
But isn't it?
But if he gave financial,
isn't there an obligation then on
But if he
the
goes,
receiver of the advice to go, well, what makes you qualified to give me that advice? Show me your registration. If you can't show me your registration, that tells me that the advice you're probably giving me is shoddy. So there's that level of protection.
yeah, but when it comes to financial advice, for instance, we would say to him, you can't say that.
Yeah.
Like stop.
But
you're in trouble.
What if you got financial advice off your uncle? Should your uncle be allowed to give you financial advice? Could you sue your uncle for giving you dodgy financial advice? And he's a plumber.
I don't know. I suspect not.
I think it comes back to that licensing and registration.
You know, there's
type of protection.
somebody in my family who knows a lot about money and finance. He won't give me financial advice.
Right.
And I've always assumed that he's just protecting himself.
Yeah.
Even though we're family, and of course I would never.
I'll give you
sue
financial
somebody.
advice.
You can give me financial.
Get a
advice.
financial advisor.
Yes.
There you go.
That's sound financial advice. But you know what I mean? So I've long had the feeling through this person in my family that in fact you could just about sue anybody if they gave you bad financial advice, could you? Or not? Or it might be that he works in the business. Is that maybe that sets him up for legal action, does it? I don't know.
Don't know the specifics, but I just find it interesting that we've highly regulated financial advice and legal advice, but when it comes to medical advice, we don't seem to have gone to the same level of regulation.
It's true.
And so that means we've got footballers and their wags running around giving medical advice that if it was financial, we would say, stop right there, but we don't. And it just seems to me to be a strange anomaly because you can obviously cause... And it's all about harm. Getting back to those first principles, is what you're doing foreseeable that it's going to cause harm?
It's about risk, and risk is measured in terms of likelihood and consequences.
Yes.
And my input here is by giving these footballers a platform, you're increasing the likelihood that their message is going to be heard by a bigger audience. And if you increase the likelihood, the consequence stays the same. Like the advice that they could give could lead to someone dying. That's as bad as it comes in terms of
just the numbers of potential victims increases.
Yeah, the likelihood of someone listening to that advice and taking it on. So I think the media has a role here to just not give them a platform. And every time a footballer or a wag says something stupid, they've got an obligation to not public it.
So you want them to censor it, to self-censor?
Yeah, I think the media plays a role in this as well.
Where do you draw the line?
It's interesting, like with Pete Evans, when he produced that sort of piece of machinery with the lights twirling.
Oh, yeah.
The machinery...
He didn't produce it, let's be fair.
Right.
It's just something that he had, that he bought.
Okay.
And I think he was also an agent, wasn't he, selling them on?
So when it came to that particular item, we could say, stop. No, can't do it. But when it came to advice, we couldn't say anything. Yet they're potentially equally as likely to cause harm.
And he was fined, wasn't he?
Yes. Yeah. So...
so why was he fined?
Because he had a gizmo.
Okay.
It was about the gizmo and not his
Not
words.
his advice, not his words. He wasn't being fined for his words. He was being fined for promoting a gizmo that probably didn't do anything, and he was saying it helps your health and protects you from COVID-19 or whatever.
Yes.
Maybe.
Yeah. So, so it's interesting how these things are looked at differently. So people say, oh, we've got all this right to free speech. Well, there's thousands of different ways that we have curtailed it if we can see that there is harm. So, bearing all that in mind, let's deal with some footballers and apply some principles. So,
good luck.
David Icke, the
British
guy,
conspiracy theorist.
Yes. So he had a podcast, and Spotify took him off.
Yeah.
What do you think of that?
So his podcast, he was talking about links between 5G and COVID-19, right? So
I guess the whole
just a
range of conspiracy.
Isn't he also one of the people who thinks that we're controlled by lizard overlords?
he probably does.
I think
yeah.
that's part of his background.
Yeah, I think so. So so Spotify.
Spotify
Is
and
Spotify,
Google
is
and
Spotify entitled to take him off their
YouTube.
list of
They were
podcasts?
probably concerned that their lizard overlords would be cross with them for allowing a competitor.
Yes.
I think they do, but I would just question why they're going so hard on any conspiracy theories related to COVID-19 and allowing conspiracy theories that could cause an equal amount of harm on all sorts of other different topics to just let them run.
I guess
There-
it's
there
the
doesn't
topic of
seem
the
to be-
day, and there are cases of people taking bleach and stuff, and actually, so there are current cases of people swallowing bleach based on advice from podcasts or others. So
Podcasts.
they can easily foresee that harm could happen.
Speaking of people taking things, I saw Donald Trump today, I think, in an interview, and somebody said to him, "Would you advise people to take hydrochlorine or whatever?"
Chloroquine or something, yeah.
I forget how to say it, that drug.
Hydrochloroquine?
And he said, "Yeah, I take it."
Yeah.
And they said,
Good.
"What?
Yeah.
You take it? What, daily?" And he was like, yeah, I take it.
Yep. He started taking it. Yeah. Good. Yeah. Because it does cause heart issues and other things.
Oh, okay.
So you're terrible if you got. Yep. Anyway, when it comes to Spotify, I think it's okay for Spotify to curate the participants on its platform. I might have a problem if they had a pure monopoly, in which case got to be a bit more careful about it.
It does set a dangerous precedent, though, when you're allowing companies like YouTube and Google and Spotify to do that, because did you hear about that video that YouTube took down? There was a medical research center in California that was actually doing some proper scientific research onto the effects of UV light on the coronavirus.
Oh, okay, right.
And they published, after Trump made a buffoon of himself during that press conference, they actually published a short YouTube clip, 2 or 3 minutes long, that explained exactly what they were doing.
Right.
And a journalist from the New York Times wrote to YouTube and got them to take the YouTube clip down.
Right.
Now that was a journalist attacking a proper
Scientific
body to take down just a publication telling the world, here's what we're doing, because it didn't fit the narrative.
Yeah.
And it kind of supported what Trump was saying.
But was it reinstated?
No, I don't
Really?
think so. No, it's been taken down. Yeah.
I'd be
So-
surprised if it doesn't get reinstated.
And the journalist was pretty proud of themselves. Like,
Right.
you know, a journalist curtailing free speech, like,
Those
It's
crazy
just crazy.
Americans. Those crazy Americans. Okay. Footballers are refusing to take the standard flu shot. So this is
A
not...
handful of footballers.
Yes.
Not all footballers.
Yes.
About 2 or 3, I think. Was
Yeah.
it in Queensland? And there's probably a few.
Maybe maximum of
the
half
other
a dozen.
states.
they've been given concessions, haven't they?
Some of them, yes. So should a footballer be able to refuse the standard flu vaccine?
Yes,
Of course.
if it's not in his contract. But
Right.
it should be in his contract.
Now, what if the government, Queensland, has passed a law to say we're not allowing your football teams here unless they've had the standard flu shot?
Then, no, he shouldn't be allowed to play.
Okay, Paul?
Why not?
So the government said you're not allowed to come into this state and play football.
Without a standard flu shot.
Correct. So the team and the NRL says, sorry, Bryce, or sorry, Bill, we can't employ you anymore because we can't use your services because you can't enter Queensland to play games now. Is that fair enough?
Look, my position, and I'm not in any way, shape or form an anti-vaxxer. I've had lots of vaccinations in my life, but I don't think anyone should be obliged to take a vaccination.
Okay. Well, he's not obliged to. He can just quit football. So the Queensland government has said, so do you feel any sympathy for the employing NRL team and the NRL Commission saying to him, really sorry, we can't have you on our books anymore because you can't play, because the
For
government has said
influenza.
you can't play.
I don't know. I don't know what to think about it.
Okay.
If it was something like Ebola, you know, because we know Ebola is spread through close contact and, you know, splashing body fluids over somebody else.
You're talking about the consequence
Exactly.
being
So
substantially...
Football is a very physical game with lots of body contact. So if it was something like Ebola, and we knew there was an outbreak of Ebola in Australia, you'd probably say, yeah, fair enough. You know, nobody wants to get Ebola.
But if a footballer gets influenza,
Yeah, they're not going to
it's
die.
like, I'm going to be on the sidelines
That's
for a week, 2 weeks, whereas I'm playing a sport where I could break my back
In other
and
words, you
be out
accept
for life.
you
and
accept
do
there's an
permanent
element of
physical-
risk in your occupation.
But the government is saying, you
Fair point.
guys are all going to be sweating on each other in scrums and all sorts of stuff. And if you develop flu-like symptoms, we don't know if you've got the ordinary flu or
They
coronavirus.
can test for it.
No, it takes a while. So
How long does it take?
it
Couple of days, most.
well, everybody who he's had contact with then has to go into quarantine because they don't say, well, we don't know if you're now normal flu or if you're coronavirus. So that's why the government is saying you've got to have a flu shot, because then we know if you develop a flu-like symptom, it's highly likely it's coronavirus. So otherwise...
I see the point that you're
right.
making, yeah.
So there we go, some sympathy.
What would you, given the choice, influenza or COVID-19? I'm going to infect you with one or the other. Which one? Which one would you? Which one do you choose?
Just the standard flu is the
Just
one.
the standard flu?
This isn't a vaccine. This is the actual flu.
This is it.
Yes. I just want the standard flu in that case.
What about you, Paul?
Because
I don't know.
is there any question about that? Why would you consider having coronavirus,
Well,
COVID-19?
the mortality rate is quite comparable, isn't it?
Well, I think you're a better chance with
With
COVID-19
because most people who get it
our
are
age and
asymptomatic.
fit and not overweight and
But would you say
having
that
no
about,
comorbidities.
I'm actually in the high risk age category now, unlike you.
the infection fatality rate, and don't quote me on this, but I think it would
Thanks, Trevor.
possibly be higher for influenza than COVID-19
The
for
inf-
our cohort.
the what would be higher?
Excuse me.
The infection fatality rate.
The mortality rate.
The mortality rate for standard flu is higher than coronavirus.
For our
our-
cohort.
For middle-aged, it can't be correct.
There's only been one Australian
But
in their 40s die of COVID-19,
But how many-
and he was overweight.
But how many
Most of them are in their 80s and 90s and have at least one. Most of them have 3 comorbidities.
Ross in the chat room says this sounds like medical advice. but how many thousands of people died in New York of COVID-19?
Yeah.
Tens of thousands. But how many
when you look at the
die in a
cohorts-
normal year of influenza in New York?
Much less.
Tens of thousands.
Much less.
I don't think so.
Yes.
Are you
Much
sure?
less. Yes. Much less.
Because every
But
year around the world, hundreds of thousands
No,
of
but
people
I
die.
would
the
I would
death
choose
rate-
COVID-19, and
What?
the only reason why I wouldn't choose COVID-19 is because I'd have to go into quarantine, and that would suck. But
Even if you have
most of the people who get COVID-19 are asymptomatic and don't show any symptoms at all. So with influenza, you might be crook for a couple of weeks or a couple of days.
But you don't have to go into isolation.
But majority of people from the research that I've done who have had COVID-19 haven't actually had a sniffle, a cough, shortness of breath, any symptom whatsoever. It hasn't affected their daily life, and they've been really surprised when they've been diagnosed with it.
Let's up the stakes. If you had to choose between Ebola and bubonic plague, which one would you choose?
This is a great game.
I
It's just like that game where you choose who would win out of a fight between Batman and Superman.
So you're saying in our age group,
Being fit.
you grab 100 people and infect 100 people with standard flu and 100 people with coronavirus of our age group, standard health, that your chances of dying are greater with the standard flu.
Yeah. And your chances of getting sick and showing
Yeah.
illnesses,
Your
like
chance
symptoms,
of getting seriously
are
sick.
much higher with influenza than what they are with
but
COVID-19.
if we were in our 60s or 70s, you wouldn't say
You'd
that.
start to worry if you were
Right.
obese.
Right.
Like,
Yep.
you don't want to be old, you don't want to be obese, and you don't want to have pre-existing comorbidities. But apart from that, you're pretty safe.
Right. Okay. Anne in the chat room says, I don't think you're keeping up with the latest research. ...
I've read a lot. Like,
Okay, he has read a lot, Anne.
the antibody tests that they're doing suggest that for every confirmed case, there's somewhere between 50 and 85 non-confirmed cases.
Yeah.
So they've been asymptomatic that they haven't even presented themselves to hospital and asked for a test.
Yeah, but
They've just had it, got over it,
I just
got
would
on
have
with their
thought the
normal life.
death rate, even in our age group, is significantly higher.
No, there's been 2 people in Australia die in their 50s and 1 person in Australia die in their 40s. There's been no one in their 30s, no one in their 20s. And a significant amount of people are actually, if you look at the infection cohorts, a lot of 20-year-olds. That cohort is the cohort where they have the most infections.
Ignoring that you're in Australia, what if you're in New York? Would you still say the same thing?
Yeah, I back my immune system
Right.
over COVID-19 before influenza.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
And
But my drama would be that I'd have to put myself into quarantine for 2 weeks, which I'd absolutely hate.
right.
I wouldn't be concerned about dying at all.
Right. Okay. That's an interesting take. I don't have the time to look at the statistics. Somebody else can look at it and say.
Well, some people are claiming that the statistics are all rubbish anyway because there are so many asymptomatic carriers of the virus anyway that they can't possibly really get an accurate number.
Just getting back to the vaccines and
Footballers.
and foreseeability of harm and when we're talking about previously, 12th man, about these sort of anti-vaxxers who are very vocal, and the question has been, well, how many people could they really harm? And the risks of stopping that free speech outweighed by the need to, support free speech. And
I think the benefit of free speech outweighs the potential harm that may arise from that bad information.
What if you're in Samoa and you were in the Samoan experience?
And you don't want to die of
They've learned
measles.
the hard way, haven't they?
Yeah. Did you read? So, dear listener.
Their attitudes have changed, haven't they?
So, in Samoa, nearly 90% of eligible people have been vaccinated against measles as it lifted a 2-day curfew imposed amid an outbreak that killed 65 people.
A lot of them children.
I think
as
this was
well.
this was 2019. So basically, they had a real problem with anti-vaxxers being quite prominent and convincing huge numbers of Samoans not to be vaccinated, and 65 people died of measles. So 12th man, maybe you would allow an anti-vaxxer measles sort of person to operate in Australia, but not in a small Polynesian country? Is that where you would...
I would not gag them anywhere.
Not even in Samoa?
No, I would merely
Really?
put up a counter argument.
Yeah,
against
I would
the
think that in
anti-vax-
Samoa, for the next 200 years, their culture will be you get
Look, they were
immunised.
Shutting
Like,
people down is not the
But
solution.
they were putting up counter arguments in Samoa, and they had no... You know, these people are convinced by these snake oil
It's a
salesmen.
lesson that they've learnt the hard way, and it's possibly a lesson that they had to learn the hard way, to be honest.
So they made a government order, and they had to shut this guy up by charging him with incitement against a government order. Like, Paul, if you've got a community in that situation who can't be convinced because the snake oil salesman has got him, you would honestly let him run rampant? You wouldn't stop him in that situation. Seriously.
Seriously, I think the
really?
principle of free speech is worth defending. And
You
I
run
think
the risk of coddling your communities.
But we had all that initial discussion about the...
once you make an exception for one thing, you're going to make exceptions for so many other things. And then what happens to free speech? It's gone.
Okay, but earlier on, we had the lead up of the principles of harm and the principles of tort and negligence.
It's a trap.
And
He's
the
leading
fac-
us
What
and
about the
fac-
principle of benefit?
No, but we agreed at that point that if harm was foreseeable, and that was the tricky part, was how foreseeable is it? But this sort of situation of Samoa, 65 kids dying of measles,
Okay.
and that you could say we've got a real problem and we have to stop it because there's no guesswork here. We have a crisis in front of us. We have to stop this guy spruiking.
I would say that all three of us are sitting here in this prosperous liberal democracy we call Australia, very, very largely due to the principle of free speech. That's a lot of benefit. Now, do you sort of say, no, we'll do without all the benefit that comes with the free exchange of ideas, which is what free speech is, and we'll just live in our backward, retarded, socially retarded way because, we can't allow these free speeches. They might talk about things that are harmful.
But I listed any number of instances that you were happy with a curtailment of free speech because of harm. Yes. And now you've just gone on to a hard line. Free speech is everything, and I don't care about the harm. But in the lead up of this,
trap.
we were listening a number of occasions where we said, "Yep, that's a good idea."
Yeah.
So, I don't get it. And I'm prepared to cut you where you might say some slack, where you might say, in Australia...
Don't cut me.
In Australia, we've got enough information and the risks are so low that maybe we'll let the anti-vaxxers do their thing.
I think it's the same with Evans,
I
this
can't
guy.
believe you couldn't look at the Samoan example and say, we have to stop them here because there's no doubt that a significant number of people are going to suffer significant harm.
People have always suffered from bad information. We know that's true.
And we have always curtailed them.
Not always.
In many times we have curtailed them.
But society as a whole and humanity as a whole has benefited immeasurably from free speech, from the free exchange of ideas. So if you say, well, we'll only curtail free speech when we know there's going to be some harm, where do you stop? Because, it's so subjective.
There's nothing subjective about the measles outbreak in Samoa. There's nothing subjective about saying that's really shitty advice. It's harming people. Stop it.
Shitty advice, I agree.
And it's objectively provable.
I would think that the benefit from Samoa with that incident is that the culture in Samoa will change now to a culture where the average citizen doesn't take advice off anyone who's not qualified to give it. And that's a good position for them to be in now. Like, not just medical advice, but all sorts of advice. Like,
will it? Because a lot of these people would have been subjected to the vaccine perhaps almost against their will, it seems. It was a government that had to say, we've got to crack down and get people vaccinated here. And my
reading on those articles was different in that, people weren't being forced. They weren't being held down and jabbed with a needle.
No, they were actually.
They were putting their hand up and saying, "I don't want to end up like cousin Jimmy."
No, here it is. I've got the line. Samoa has declared a state of emergency and made vaccinations compulsory. That's what they had to do.
Right.
A mandatory immunisation campaign.
Yeah.
Tripled Samoa's
But
coverage in a few weeks.
were there still people objecting to being injected?
The fact that they had to make it compulsory suggests that, yes, that's what they had to do.
But look, we've seen mass immunisation programs in so many countries around the world in the last, 50 years or so. Most people, when you explain to them the benefits, they do it voluntarily. You don't have to force them.
But this group, you had to.
Well, they may be a special group, but maybe they just haven't been told persuasively
So
enough.
if you were in charge of Samoa, you wouldn't.
If I was the king of Samoa,
you would have let the anti-vaxxer continue to propagate his
The
snake oil.
other question is, how do you stop someone from propagating disinformation?
You pass a law and you say, well, as they did in this case, he was charged with incitement against a government order.
Was he
Edwin Tamasesi.
Was he a local?
Tamasesi. Edwin Tamasesi.
Was he a church leader or something like
Possibly. I don't know. I just a strong suspicion he was. Yeah.
Because maybe you could pass a law to stop him working that sort of advice into his sermons and broadcasting it, or on a radio program, or in a newspaper that he might be the editor of. But you wouldn't be able to stop him from having one-on-one conversations with people, would you? You couldn't legislate against that.
If he was caught, you could. The difficulty is catching him in those instances. But if he was caught, you could.
Hey, just get somebody to follow him around everywhere, and every time he starts talking about vaccinations are bad, have somebody who's properly informed there saying, "Hang on a minute."
Because the drama
see a
there
limit
too
to
is
that?
I have a counter argument.
the drama there too is if Big Brother comes in and starts enforcing this speech on these people, then it just goes underground, and that adds to their conspiracy, doesn't it? It's like, look, the government's making us do it. Like, we don't have a choice, and it adds to their case almost.
People will be suspicious of all kinds of things.
It'll make them more suspicious of the vaccines if the government is too heavy-handed with it. So it's a real balancing act, I think.
Oh, I don't think there's anything balancing to be done in an iron fist government in Samoa.
Your autocratic tendencies are coming out now.
Not my autocratic. I want to thank the patrons. Thank you, Sean, Janelle, Craig, John, Landon Hardbottom. Landon, haven't heard from you for ages.
Yeah, Landon,
come on.
I want to know how you're handling this pandemic.
Come on, Landon. You can get some recording gear happening wherever you are.
I'm sure he's got
down
plenty
there.
of time there on his hands to be.
Also, Wayno, Ayame, Allison, Steve Shinners, Tony Wall, Jimmy Spud, Kane Birch, Bronwyn Ben, Matt J, Robert Whitby, Palais Maddockman, Dominic Damasi, Liam McMahon, Dave Ryland, Daniel Curtin, Harry Watson, Peter Gillespie, Captain Doomsday. Send us some good messages during the week. Good luck in the bunker there, Captain Doomsday. Actually, his message was we were talking about shutting off your phone for, we're talking about the app and whether you should have the app. And I said, well, I'm already exposed in any number of ways with my phone to the world. And so if I was really concerned about privacy, I would have to get rid of all those. And we said it would be quite difficult.
Do you know, I came across a comment on Facebook.
Jodie Willett.
Yeah, did you read that?
My mate Jodie Willett, yeah.
Oh, your mate?
Yes.
Can I read a bit of
She
it?
commented on one of
Because
my posts. It was a very good point, wasn't
Yeah,
it?
very good point. And I was just like, wow.
G'day, Jodie, if you're listening.
Jodie,
Hi, Jodie.
let me just find it. Okay, talk about something else while I find the comment.
Okay, I'll keep going through the patrons while you're doing that. Captain Doomsday, Wheat Watcher, Andy Dowling, Murray Waper, Melinda, Adam Priest, Professor Dr. Dentist, Will, my brother Glenn Bell, who's currently in hospital suffering a minor stroke. So Glenn is on the road to recovery. Craig S, Matthew, Alexander Allen, Paul Waper, Tom Doolan, Tero, Camille, Kim Broon, Donny Darko, Clinton Riggs, Gavin S, Tony Eels, yet another Pinker fan. Speaking of which, I've ordered Pinker's other book. about.
Read the first one.
I've got the one about violence, and I didn't like it. I was like, I'm not going to disagree with you about violence.
What
You've
was it?
got-
The angels of our better
Yeah.
natures.
Better angels of our nature.
because okay, the world's less violent because we've got
But
people.
he makes more points than just there's less violence in the
As I
world.
was
There's
reading
there's
the-
more to the book than
Okay,
that.
I
Trevor.
bought the other one, which is the world's wonderful and poverty's declining, and that's the one I really
And
want.
don't worry about the future.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
because
Everything's going to be sweet.
because my mate Bill Gates has got. That's the one I'm going to critique.
tear apart.
Yeah.
Oh, this was on.
Nice to see that you got a good open mind going into the reading of that book there, Trevor.
Well,
This
No,
was on. Was it?
Can I just put it
Facebook
to
page.
Trevor?
Absolutely.
I've got a different way of putting this to Trevor. You've got the COVID Safe app, right?
no, because
You don't.
I
You,
put it
you
on.
did install it.
I put it on, and the day I put it on, I was out and about, and my battery ran flat 2 times. Like it just, I've got a really old iPhone,
Yeah.
iPhone 5 or something, and it just drained the battery in.
So you've taken it off.
So I had to take it off.
Oh,
'cause
you
it's
think
just-
the app was draining your battery?
Yes, it's known to do that on old
I
iPhones.
see.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
it completely drained it within an
Yeah.
hour, and I couldn't recharge it. I was running around without a phone for half a
But,
day.
but
'cause
you recommend that people install it?
I was saying, why not? Because you can always delete it.
Yeah. Rightio.
And it was about privacy, wasn't
yeah.
it?
So if your phone it didn't drain the battery, you'd still have it on your phone.
I
It's still
would.
active.
Yeah, I would.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. If you got a message, if say that happened,
Mm-hmm.
and you had, you've had it on your phone for the last 2 weeks, and you got a message at the end of the podcast saying you've been next to somebody who's had COVID-19. Self-quarantine yourself now for the next 2 weeks.
Because I've been next to somebody for 15 minutes.
Within 1.5 metres.
Okay, here's what they wouldn't send me a message like that. They would actually ring me and talk to me. So that's the first
But
thing.
the same condition,
And-
and they said you're
So,
suspected.
so
as being-
part of
Yeah, but
part of the
that's-
rules
yeah.
is that you've now got to quarantine yourself for the next 2 weeks.
Yeah, but if somehow I was with somebody for 15 minutes,
No, but it might be a false positive, of which that's
I'm okay with that.
yeah. So
You're okay with
you've
it?
gone in. You've gone into a public bathroom
For 15
and
and in the, and
I've sat on the toilet for
Yeah,
15
and
minutes,
in
and
the
the guy in the
next door
neighbouring
toilet.
stall has been another guy.
well,
That's right.
I get my business done in under
let's-
15 minutes, I can tell you.
You're constipated. No, let's not go there. Let's just say you're pretty confident that you've not been within 1.5 metres of anyone.
Nah, but they're going to ring me and they're going to say, you were in a line at
No, they don't know the location.
they're going to say a time and a date, and they're going to say you were in with this person in contact.
Yeah.
And
you have
we've
to be
worked
in,
out.
You've got to be in quarantine now for 2
Yeah.
weeks. Would you accept that and go, oh, all right then?
Well, yeah.
and
I
then
would.
the day after the quarantine ends, you get another call, and they say, "Oh, sorry, Trevor, but we've just got another indication you've been in close contact with someone who tested positive. Another 14 days, mate.
Well,
It's possible."
that's okay.
And then you get a third
The
one.
government's paid me a lot of money in recent times. Like,
Is
my
that
mate-
fair compensation for
What
being
if,
shut?
what if you've got a business that you need to...
well, you were asking me and what I would do.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's honest answer is I'm okay with
But
it.
that's just a scenario
So
that
you're
I wasn't
saying
aware of. Like
That you'll
and
be
it's-
asked to self-quarantine and you may not like doing
and
that.
possibly
Or-
repeatedly.
or feel like I
And they-
haven't actually been in contact with someone.
With 12 active cases in Queensland,
It's just a possibility, Trevor.
well, you are the one who, all through this podcast, talks about the low possibility of harm to people, and
I didn't download the app.
and here we've got like a 12 in 3 million chance that you could see somebody, let alone have 15 minutes of contact.
Okay,
with them.
but this person put up
So-
a very good argument why she didn't download
it was
the
the
app.
argument you just put forward that you might be actually, but that's how it's supposed to work. And the chances are so small.
Apparently, she lives in Tasmania,
Right.
Jody, and there was an outbreak in a care village nursing home
In
somewhere
northwest Tasmania
in northwest
somewhere.
Tasmania, and they put, I forget the figures, but it was something like 5,000 people into self-quarantine because of
Good.
tracing,
Good.
and 10 of those had COVID-19.
5,000. You reckon that's good?
Yeah.
Really? 5,000 people having their lives totally disrupted for 2 weeks.
Sit at home and watch Netflix.
Yeah,
I've been
see,
at home
that's
for 6
another
weeks.
problem I've got.
And
Like,
the government's going to give you money for sitting on
I
your
couldn't
butt.
do that. Like that's torture for me. like the people saying this is great. Sit on my butt and watch Netflix
It's
for
not
2 weeks.
great.
That's
It's boring.
not appealing to me at all.
Well,
and
it may not
like
be appealing,
you're
but
projecting your values onto everyone else. Like you've got this nice, comfortable home. You know, you're
I could
quite
podcast
comfortable
for 2 weeks.
sitting at home,
Clearly.
twiddling your thumbs and watching Netflix. That would
I'm in a privileged position.
like someone like me who has like freedom at their top of their yearning hierarchy. Like
Yeah.
that's just
It's torture, isn't it?
it's torture for me.
Yeah. Well, in Queensland, your chances would be so low that relax was.
So you're playing the numbers now.
Yeah.
Whereas
everyone
this
should be
person was
relaxed.
objecting, who had very, I think, very sound reasons for not downloading the app.
Because
Because
there was a high probability that she might come into contact with someone.
or
that's how it's supposed to
or get a
work.
false positive, Trevor. And there are false positives.
Well, okay, you've come into contact with person. Oh, we've just discovered that person didn't have it. You're okay. You don't need to be in quarantine now.
That's not how it works, though, is it?
Yes, it
Once they
is.
tell
But-
you,
Why wouldn't it? They've rung you up and they've said, you're in a queue with Joe Bloggs and he's got coronavirus. And then 3 days later, they find out Joe Bloggs doesn't have coronavirus. They ring up the people and say,
No,
yes,
how-
good news.
no, what about all those people who arrive from
But he
overseas?
had coronavirus when he was in contact with
And
you. So
But you said a false positive.
Yeah, what about all those people who arrive from overseas
false
on planes,
positive contact.
were bussed to hotels, and even though they didn't test for positive for the virus, they were put into hotels for 14 days.
Poor things.
Paul's talking about a false positive in terms of the contact, not a false
Meaning
positive.
the app was faulty.
Yeah, like it's Bluetooth. Like, what's your experience been like with Bluetooth? Mine hasn't been good. Like, it's not the most accurate form of technology, right? Bluetooth.
Well, this is where I'd be saying...
I can't get my computer to talk to my
this
printer.
This is what I'd be
So-
saying to them. Where did this 15 minutes of contact happen? Tell me where. And
But they don't have to justify their orders.
You've downloaded the app. You've signed up to the app.
Yeah,
You've
yeah,
signed the terms
yeah,
and
but
conditions.
They don't have
You're
to
in
justify an
quarantine.
order. They can order you to go into quarantine for 14
yeah,
days.
but they're going to tell you because they need to know who are you with who may not have the app. They're going to ring you and say, you had the app and you were there for 15 minutes. Was your partner with you at the time? And you're going to say, well, where was it? When? What date? What time? I was at such and such a place. Well, actually, I only went into that shop for 5 minutes. There's no way I could be. So,
Do you think they're going to say, oh, well, that's all right then?
So if you had the app and Mrs. Fist didn't,
yes,
and you were in contact
yes,
with somebody,
yes,
you've come home,
yes.
and you're possibly infected, she would have to go into quarantine too then.
Yes, it should be a mutual decision of a couple. If it's one in, all in.
Yes. Well, in
There
that
you go.
case, it's Mrs. Fist's decision.
Everything is Mrs. Fist's decision. Let me finish with the patrons. Where did we get to? Yet another Pinker fan, I think was the last one. Graham Hannigan, Mark Clark, Citizen 6, David Copley, Lloyd Berg, the 12th Man fan. Lloyd Berg, have I poked any holes in the 12th Man's arguments? Have you switched? Can you be Lloyd Berg, the Iron Fist fan now? Like, surely I've taken some of the shine off him. But anyway, Andrew Jackson, David
chipping
Cox,
away, Trev.
Shane Ingram. You see, so these people have seen, now the ones I'm going to call now have been since March, which would have been COVID-19 time. So David Cox, Shane Ingram, Craig Ball, Kobe, LB, P. Slizzle, Shay. Shay, who did the interview. Thank you, Shay, for the interview last week. That was fun. Stephen Twigger, Yvonne Panisi, David Hanby, and another Wayne, and people who are patrons outside of Patreon are Dean, Ken, thank you, the beneficiary, Mr. Anderson, Corinne, Mattman, Beverly, Bossy, Anne Reid, Damien from Redline Digital, Wayne Seaman, Jared Terry, Obrad Puskarika, and Darren Giddens. Thank you, all of those patrons. I actually did a bit of a tally up of all my expenses, and I spent a shitload on the website, I've discovered. The website's actually quite a big website. There's a lot of information on there, and to keep it going quick, I'm on this super deluxe sort of plan. It's quite expensive, and the MP3 file has to be held somewhere, and I've got subscriptions with New York Times and The Guardian and Crikey and The Australian and Sydney Morning Herald and the Courier Mail, and there's the Zoom app, and there's the RSS feeder and a few other things. Sorry.
There's a tab on the website too that allows listeners to become beer sponsors too, isn't there?
There is. If you'd like to be a beer sponsor, you can click on that and look up.
Maybe Scott can become a beer sponsor.
Actually, Wayno sent me a beer, so gave me some money for beers, so we're good for beers for the little while. But
Good.
thank you to the dear patrons, especially those who in these dark COVID-19 times have reached into their pocket and decided to help support our humble podcast. So
I wonder if any of the sponsorship money is coming out of anyone's JobKeeper or JobSeeker allowance.
yes, maybe.
So, maybe
Times are
we should
tough.
be thanking ScoMo as well.
Maybe. So, well, I reckon that's, geez, we're up to an hour 40. Better stop. Mrs.
hour
Fist is
40.
going to...
I was going to talk about my stick that I
What
got
stick?
at the cafe.
Oh, yeah, tell me about that. Go on.
Yeah.
Why not?
So I went to my local cafe 2 days ago, and the new rules are that you can have 10 people in the cafe. So they've got a system where there's 10 sticks in a bucket, and to be able to sit down and enjoy your coffee, you have to register your name and your phone number and get a stick and have the stick on your table. But I thought it was interesting that they're the rules for up here in Queensland, at least anyway.
So
That's the government rule. Yep.
that's how they set
and
the limits.
I'm not quite sure whether it's a requirement that you have to give your name and phone number to be able to sit down and enjoy your meal or your coffee or whatever.
Next-
but I thought that was a bit of an intrusion of
It sounds like it, doesn't
rights,
it? Because
to be
you
honest.
don't normally expect to be asked for your name and phone number when you go into a cafe and buy a coffee, do you?
So wondering what other people's experiences are with that.
That's
and whether they've... I imagine there's some people who have turned around and stormed out because of privacy. And
I would be a little bit confronted by that, I have to say.
yeah, I spoke to my barista this morning, and he said it's regulated. They've been asked to do it, and the intention is that if there is an infection related back to the store, that they can contact everyone that was there that day and let them know.
But see, that doesn't
So-
necessarily mean all those people go into quarantine.
I don't think so. Yeah, but the intentions are good, but it kind of oversteps the mark a little bit, I think, in terms of privacy.
Yeah. I found very confronting a photo, and it may have been just a photo, of concrete blocks across a roadway, allegedly on the
across a
border between Queensland and New South Wales.
Yeah.
Yep.
Now, I dare say a lot of our listeners live in New South Wales and Victoria, which did not close the borders. Us guys up here in Queensland, in the Banana Republic of Queensland, our Premier,
God's country.
has publicly stated she may not open the borders until
September.
September.
Yes.
I mean, that's an outrageous
June, July, August,
deprivation
another 4
of
months
our right to liberty in this country.
when we have 12 active cases.
12 cases, and we've got concrete blocks
We've had
on
two
roads,
people
allegedly.
die in the last fortnight.
It's outrageous. So what do our southern listeners think of that?
So did you feel the same when they first instituted the state border?
I was annoyed, I have to say. I don't think, in the modern state of Australia, where our actual states are really just administrative areas, aren't they? They're not like separate little
It's a
countries.
hark back to colonial times, really. I think we'd be better off without states.
I think we'd be better off without the states. Although, to be fair, I think some people say we're over-governed. I think having lots of government is actually healthy because it sort of diffuses power. You know what I mean?
So the
Do
point
you
is,
think the state borders closing is a good thing?
well, you see, when it first happened, we didn't know what we were dealing with. So you kind of had to take a very cautious approach because you didn't know what was happening with this virus and how it was moving, and really a case where you crack down hard and then see what you're dealing with, and then you can decide what to do.
But when have they ever done that before?
How many cases are in New South Wales? Active.
Don't know.
It's a lot more than Queensland.
Yeah.
But
So it seems that there's still community transmission happening in New South Wales, which we don't have here.
I think the state that's performing the worst in terms of infection is Victoria,
Right.
and they have the most stringent lockdown.
Yeah.
and
So
also the Premier
it's
of
kind of
Queensland.
evidence that
But
you know,
that's where
being
you get,
hard on lockdown
yeah, but that's where you get that
isn't necessarily
supercell.
infected.
Like you were talking about supercell type
Yeah,
stuff,
super
where you just get
spreaders.
super spreaders. And there was that guy who was a delivery driver visiting McDonald's stores. So he closed down 12 McDonald's stores because so you get unlucky as well, even with the best of intentions. A super spreader just hits you and kind of throws patterns and that sort of, you can't work them out if you just get unlucky with a super spreader. Yep.
What about Bob Katter's idea of closing off the North Queensland? Would you have supported that idea? In the early stages of the pandemic, there were negligible cases in North Queensland, and he was saying, well, if you're shutting the border with New South Wales, let's throw a arbitrary border across, above Yeppoon somewhere between Rockhampton and Gladstone.
And he
Would you have supported that? And the expense that would have taken to have police on all of those checkpoints checking people
And do you know
six
what
of one, half a
Palaszczuk-
dozen of another. You're drawing rough lines to try and control the population. I mean, if there's an outbreak in the Gap, if there's some outbreak at the school, the local shops, and they say, people in the Gap, you're a special case now. You have to do these extra things because you're in the Gap. I can understand that. Yeah. But
The other problem I have is the way that the lockdown has been enforced. Apparently in Sweden, people were encouraged to practice social distancing, and they were encouraged to wash their hands more and things like that. And they did. They did it voluntarily. I don't see why that wouldn't work as well in Australia.
government
Most
treated them
Australians are pretty
like
cooperative.
adults.
Yeah, pretty mature, usually do the right thing. And yet in Victoria, I saw a figure today, it was, $6 million or
Worth
something?
of fines.
Worth of fines have been handed out in the last 6 weeks.
so that would mean that people weren't doing the right thing.
Yes, but you shouldn't.
Doesn't that counter your argument?
Yes, but a lot of the cases as well were, pretty sort of challengeable. And some people did challenge them and the fines were revoked. I just think the government has taken
So it
the
wasn't
wrong
a large
approach.
amount then.
I think the government is taking the wrong approach. Rather than treat us like adults who can be trusted, of course there'll always be a few that won't comply. They should have treated us like responsible adults and said, please, this is what you need to do to stay safe. I think most people would have done it. But instead,
There's data that shows that people were going in and locking down before the rules
Yes,
even come into place.
that's right.
In most countries.
I really object.
Some people
to the
would do the
policing.
right thing and some people wouldn't. And
So-
some people So if you were
What
going
difference would it make?
okay, if you were going to do the right thing anyway, then whether there's a law or not makes no difference to you. But if you were going to do the wrong thing, the fact that there's a law makes you do the right thing.
Yes, but people who were not doing anything that was outside the normal parameters of daily life were issued fines for being in a park, for being away from home. This is ridiculous.
Well, sure, but there were plenty who were doing the wrong thing.
Are you sure? Plenty?
Well, you just said, there were $6 million worth of fines
Yes,
issued, and
that
you're
doesn't
saying now
mean
that
they were doing the wrong thing. That means the
that doesn't mean that
police
they were
were
taking
very
it.
active with their fine books.
Yeah.
well, what's the question?
The question is, don't you think the government should have
No.
managed it differently?
No, I'm
and
quite-
trusted people
No.
and said,
You can't trust people.
Oh, come on.
No, you can't. For the people who want to do the right thing, it was no problem. Not going to be fined. I was never worried about being fined. 'Cause
I
doing the
was.
doing the right thing.
Because a friend wanted to meet me for a coffee in a park one morning,
Right.
and I suggested a park, and he said, no, I won't go there, the cops might come.
Right.
You know, two guys sitting in a park drinking coffee, and he was nervous about doing that because he thought we might be fined.
Right. Kobe in the chat room says Swedes have 343 deaths per million. We have 4.
Yeah, the Swedes are about middle of the pack in terms of death.
But
per
how do
capita
they
for
count
Europe.
them? Because they were counting a lot of people that perhaps
The
didn't.
UK's worse,
didn't die
Spain's
of
worse,
COVID, yeah.
Italy's worse. They're on a par with Netherlands.
Same in Belgium. Do you know in Belgium?
But that seems to be a way bigger figure, even allowing for some accounting discrepancies. 343 versus 4? Doesn't that sound like...
Yeah, so then you would compare Sweden, you would compare, say, Denmark to Norway, right? Both Scandinavian countries.
No, but hang on a second. We're in an argument where we're saying we should have done what Sweden did. So now you're going to go into, compare
If we'd have done
Sweden
what
with some other
Sweden
country.
did, we wouldn't have had the deaths per capita that Sweden did.
Right.
And also,
Because
Sweden wouldn't.
we haven't got the same border situation.
Because of lots of different variables.
Right.
And a
Such-
lot of the people who
such
died in
as-
Sweden
Such
died
as...
in old people's homes.
Yeah.
They did, and apparently they didn't really protect them very effectively at all. And that's why they had a whole rush of old people die in Sweden, because they didn't take precautions.
Same would have happened here then.
well, what they're saying is the people would have probably died eventually anyway when the
'Cause they're old
virus
people.
spreads through the population. They would have died a little bit sooner or a little bit later, but they probably would have died anyway.
But the point I was trying to make is that Denmark's deaths per capita is double that of Norway's. So
Yes.
what have Denmark done wrong?
And what have they done wrong?
Well,
Have they done the same
Denmark
things?
and
What is
Norway
the-
have done the same things,
Right.
essentially.
So what's your explanation?
Well, it's just, again, it's like what you were saying about Victoria. It's just luck. Like,
And it's a guessing game, largely.
it's these
isn't it?
super spreading cells.
Okay,
and
but if we'd have followed Sweden, then it would have gone through our old age homes.
A little bit quicker, perhaps.
Quicker, it hasn't gone through them except for just 2 or 3 old age homes.
There've
in
been a
Australia.
few old people's homes where they've had clusters.
Yeah,
but not every old-
virtually I mean, let's face it, Australia's virtually untouched, but it would have. We would have.
there's a fair percentage that have happened in aged care facilities in Australia.
Look, the point is,
We've had 100 deaths.
we
in Australia.
probably wouldn't have had
Yeah, but a
that
fair
many more
percentage of
deaths
them have come from
Okay.
aged care facilities.
with voluntary.
The
social
comparison I like
distance.
to make is between us and New Zealand. Like, New Zealand's deaths per capita is higher than Australia's,
Right.
yet they locked down much harder, and their first death occurred a full month after our first death. So they locked down early, they locked down hard. We've got pretty much the same population density, the same culture, and theirs is worse than ours.
Yeah, but ours is 4 per million. What's theirs?
Theirs is like 4.5 or something like
Well,
that.
when you say worse, we're in the ballpark. Like, that just allows for statistical anomalies. Like, when you're in that
But
sort of
their
ballpark.
their additional lockdown didn't have a significant effect.
In other words, there was no net benefit from locking down hard.
Right. But back to Sweden and Australia, you don't say if we had followed Sweden that pretty much we would have lost thousands in nursing homes or
Not
not?
necessarily. No,
I mean,
I'm
Sweden
not
did.
saying we should have
Sweden
followed.
did,
I'm not
so why
saying
wouldn't we?
I'm not saying we should have followed Sweden's negligence with their old people's homes. And even people in Sweden are saying their death toll would have been lower if they'd taken the proper precautions to protect old people. But like everybody around the world, it was a big guessing
And their
game.
new immigrant community as well has been
That's
pretty,
right,
pretty
yes.
hardly hit.
But if we had have encouraged sensible measures for individuals, sensible social distancing, hand washing, all those things, not touching,
And protected the vulnerable. I
and
think that was
protected the
key thing.
vulnerable, we probably would have ended up with roughly the same number of deaths, I think.
Well,
And without destroying the economy.
I mean,
Because the Swedes haven't destroyed their economy. That's the difference.
It's not going great.
But it's a lot better than ours.
is it?
Oh yeah, their factories are
They're
starting
highly
to produce
dependent on
again.
trade with other countries whose economies have turned to pot. So I think that's the biggest impact that they've had on their economy is that their trading partners' economies
Are stuffed.
are stuffed. So as a result, they are too.
Well, I mean, here's the question: how much is a life worth?
$4.2 million, Trevor,
Exactly. Yes,
in 2014 Australian dollars.
that's right. Yes,
4.2 million.
got
And
a
that
link.
works out to be $200,000 per life year.
Yes. So there's a link to an article which basically looked at how much government spends in order to save lives and sort of came up with a figure, but I couldn't see the workings out on it. So I'm a bit dubious about the 4.2 figure. John in the chat room says, you're outnumbered tonight, Trev. I think I am, John.
And he loves it. He's secretly licking his lips here. He loves it.
Yeah, I think I am. Righto. Well, look, an hour 56. A bonus. See, most podcasts will give you an hour. There we go. You get 2 from us. So there you go.
2 for the price of 1.
Yeah. There's so much going on. Like these are massive these are unthinkable things. Like a
Yes.
year ago, the thought of shutting down our country, shutting down the border.
I'll tell you what,
Queensland,
a
New South
year
Wales.
ago, the thought of Scotty from marketing being our Prime Minister, that was unthinkable.
That's right. The world has changed. And, the world has changed so much so quickly. It is a very interesting time.
And it's sort of the anniversary, isn't it, of Scotty's
yeah.
big surprise win.
Yes.
Yesterday, I think.
Yes. Yep. So, all right. Well, to those who stayed in the chat room, there's 13 of you there by the looks of it. Good on you who are watching. Thanks for staying with us. Thanks for all your comments. Sorry if we didn't get to all of them, but much appreciated. And
I had a final comment.
yes.
You keep harping on about Murdoch,
Yes.
and it occurred to me that
Stop. You're not going to
he's
justify
now an
Murdoch.
American
Looks
citizen.
like we're going over 2
He's
hours.
been an American citizen for years.
I know, but why hasn't the Australian government ruled him out of owning our media
He had to
because
sell
he's a
some.
foreigner?
When he took up American citizenship in order to buy American assets,
Mm-hmm.
he had to get rid of some Australian.
No, I want to know
properties.
why, if our senators with dual citizenship cannot sit in the Senate, why do we allow someone with dual citizenship to own a media empire in Australia? Who has more power,
well,
a senator or a
Section,
media baron?
Section 44 is a stupid part of the Constitution anyway. Like, who cares if? Well, actually,
I think it's not a bad provision myself.
I don't understand why we have
Split
dual.
loyalty.
We shouldn't have dual citizenship.
No,
We should be saying, do you want an Australian passport?
I agree.
Give up your other
I agree.
passports.
Choose.
Yes.
Do you want to be Australian?
Which
Do you
one
want
do
to
you
be something else?
Yes, so we shouldn't have dual citizens.
But at the same time, don't you think I'm making a fair case why Murdoch shouldn't own a media empire in Australia?
Yeah, it's solid case.
You're saying that no foreigners should own our media.
I think so.
He had to sell some when he became a foreigner.
Well, he should have sold the lot.
Yeah,
He is now effectively a foreigner owning a very influential media empire in this country. I don't think
Start a
that
petition.
is-
Let's get him.
Shall we start
kicked
one?
out.
The worst part isn't that
We'd be
he's a
better off for
foreigner.
it.
The worst part is that he's Murdoch. So, so
Whatever.
that's the problem.
Whatever.
Yeah.
If he was an Australian, I don't have a problem with it.
Well, if he's Australian and he's spruiking the sort of policies that he spruiks now, it wouldn't be any better. So it's not, the biggest problem isn't that he's a foreigner, it's the agenda that he has. That's the
Well,
problem.
If he was just an Australian, at least we would know that his loyalty lies with Australia, more or less. Probably.
Would we?
Whereas with he's a foreign
Let's see,
citizen.
Paul.
He's
What
loyal
if, we
to
went to, what if we
multi-billionaire-
went to war with America?
Just because a
Do you think Murdoch would fight with the Americans?
because a
or with us?
multi-billionaire with properties all over the world happens to have an Australian passport, you go, oh, I feel comfortable now. His loyalties are with Australia. But Paul.
No, I agree with you. We shouldn't have dual citizenships.
Yeah. All right. I got to sign off on this podcast. We're done.
Eventually.
We're out of here. Thanks very much. We'll see you next week.
So yeah.
Thanks, listeners. Hope you enjoyed the episode.